would a national government be willing to agree to Māori playing a statutory role in the allocation and ongoing management of water resources?
Well, we've been discussing it with them for a number of years, and we certainly have not agreed to that.
But presuming that the Waitangi Tribunal, when it eventually completes its inquiry, recommends something along those lines, and that is the condition on which you get a settlement on water, would you be willing to agree to it? We're not going to speculate about that, because there's a number of different ways in which a settlement on water or progress on water could be made. So far, we've focused on rights and interests, not ownership, and that's taken us a long way down. It's a long way towards what we've now achieved, which is this national measurement system, the national policy statement that's in place, some changes to the RMA, which enable local Māori interests to be expressed. We haven't been, in fact, we said explicitly a number of years ago we weren't aiming for a national settlement, and that hasn't changed.
Do you agree with your Minister when he says that if it would introduce Labour's water royalty, that it would cause these treaty settlements, existing ones, to be renegotiated?
Well, it could cause a lot of problems, because a royalty implies ownership, and that ownership will certainly be contested by iwi. Up to now, the government has never asserted ownership in that way, and I think the Labour Party has just bumbled into it. I don't think they've thought about it.
But Labour says these existing settlements explicitly have clauses which say the freshwater issue is unresolved.
Well, I think they quoted the Ngāi Tahu settlement, and I'm advised they're just wrong. Ngāi Tahu settlement does not say that. But with whatever the settlements say, the royalty asserts Crown ownership. That has never been done. And the Labour Party have bumbled into it. It's another half-thought-through policy done on the fly because of it look politically attractive. They've now asserted ownership, and that means ownership's going to be contested. We've spent 9 years on this issue. We've never asserted ownership, but we have worked with Māori on rights and interests, because that's been a much more constructive way forward.
And you've suggested that water trading could be one option here, but does that get around this issue?
Well, that would have to be discussed. I mean, that's why we've now got to the allocation phase of what's been a 6 or 7 year discussion, including with the Land and Water Forum. Everyone involved in that discussion, I think, has a deep appreciation of the complexity of the environmental issues, but also the technical allocation and ownership issues. It's pretty clear the Labour Party have paid no attention to it whatsoever. I think their attitude is reckless. We've worked very hard to preserve the Crown's position, very hard to respect Māori rights and interests, and in that context we've been able to make major progress on lifting our environmental standards, to the point where last week we finalised what would be, I think, 5 or 6 years of work on the national policy statement that now allows us to measure water quality and make progress.
Does that mean that we absolutely can't have royalty on bottled water?
Well, I'm just saying their policy asserts ownership, and therefore ownership will be contested.
But you're examining the possibility of charging for people to bottle water. Wouldn't that be a royalty? Wouldn't that assert ownership if you do that?
Well, it's gone. We treat it as part of the discussion about water allocation, and that discussion is a difficult one, precisely for the reasons I've just outlined. That if you don't want a contest over ownership, then you have to think about the mechanisms.
So can you rule out today national imposing a royalty or applying a royalty to water bottlers?
We can't see a way that you can apply a royalty that does not end up with a contest over who owns that water.
How can you end up with an allocation regime that does not make provision for Māori?
That's the question ahead of us. What the point I'm making is you can't just bumble into it, asserting ownership and hoping that Māori will take no notice.
But you've said, in answer to an earlier question, that you didn't believe that Māori could play a role in the allocation and ongoing management of water resources. Now you're saying it's a question ahead of you. Which one is it?
No, I said...
Are they out, or are you still considering bringing them in?
I said we haven't agreed to it. That's what I said. And that is, look, these issues are about dealing with uncertainty. Out ahead of us, Māori are assert rights and interests in water. We've been dealing with that pretty successfully, but it takes an awful lot of work. we've made some real progress that now is enabling us to lift environmental standards. If you talk to Māori, they'll tell you the next big issue is allocation. And that's partly because they want access to water, which they haven't been able to get for commercial purposes, and partly because some of them assert an ownership. And so we're going through a process that treads very carefully but respectfully through that minefield. The Labor Party have blundered in, asserted ownership, and so that's going to be contested. Of course, the other question for them is what their proposed coalition partner Winston Peters thinks about it.
But what circumstances do you think there are under which it becomes possible to manage water unless it has some pricing mechanism attached? And how likely is it that you would ever get a treaty settlement, any treaty settlements around water if they don't have some degree of monetary value involved?
I think that's yet to be seen. That's why we've set achievable goals about how to evolve water policy. We're very proud of the progress that we've made, particularly with the finalising now a national measurement system for water quality, which is the striking bit about that is it's almost all agreed. Māori, recreational farmers, commercial users, fishermen, they've been all part of that process. That's the kind of effort that it takes to make progress, and some would argue the hard bit is ahead of us.
So why not look at a water lords deal to solve these issues of allocation and pricing? It seemed to work for the fishing industry.
Because it's much more complicated, that's why.
When you say that you're going to look at the question of allocation and management, does that, and that you have not agreed to it so far, does that mean that you could agree to it in certain circumstances in the future?
I wouldn't want to hypothesise, because what we've learned from working with Māori on this over now, 8 or 9 years, pretty intensively. I mean, we set up this whole process back in 2010 and 11, is that you don't move ahead of them. You don't do anything other than work respectfully with the different points of view and set some achievable goals and move ahead. And what's striking about Labor's policy is their ignorance of the process that's gone on in this country for the last 10 years, going in, asserting ownership, untrustworthy on the tax rate. They said they'd set it after the election, and now they're trying to set one before. And if they make it big, they know people will be against it. If it's too small, which looks like where they're headed, then it doesn't make any difference. What's the point? And it's a bit of a shambles, frankly, and it sets a very poor ground for actually resolving the issues.
Isn't it just the case, though, that it's just been put into too hard baskets for too many years, and that's why you've got all these issues like water bonders that are causing so much motion around the issue of water?
No, it's not a matter of it being in the too hard basket. It's a matter of resolving the issues you can where you can get agreement, and we've made major progress on that. 4 or 5 years ago, there was no measurement system for water quality in New Zealand. Now we have, along with the European Union, the only other country in the world that has one that's comprehensive and been agreed to by all those who have an interest in it. So it's watertight, if I can use that term, and now we can show progress towards the detailed goals that we've set. That's backed up by extensive government investment in clean-up funds and increasing community involvement in areas like the Waikato River, the Rotorua Lakes, the Taupo catchment, where they've got nitrate trading and water trading, or nitrate trading going on. So it's creating a framework for all sorts of policy innovation, where iwi are positive about what's being achieved and taking part and pushing us along. The next bit is going to be reasonably challenging.
But isn't the iwi Leaders Forum also pushing for a water lords deal? How could you solve this allocation issue without a water lords deal?
Well, when we've tested rights and interests, it turns out that there's a whole lot of local rights and interest. They don't assert, and haven't for some time, a national Māori interest in water. Because that's been a big part of the discussion. It turns out that their rights and interests are highly localised, and they range from an interest in resource management through to a small number of cases where there's assertion of very close customary use and maybe ownership of particular water sources.
You see a situation where nitrates trading is more widespread around the country, scenario of that happening?
Oh, it's possible, but it's very dependent on the particular catchments and whether it's appropriate or not.